Hello and welcome to Fiction Fans, a podcast where we read books and other words too. I'm Lily.
And I'm Sarah.
And today we are going to be talking about The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, or Jert to his friends. But before we get there...
Although, wait, I do want to say that he was genuinely called Tollers, and I kind of love that as a nickname.
Oh, that's much cuter than my nickname, which is actually just making fun of his initials.
I mean, I can't make fun of you for calling him Jert when I do call George R.R. Martin Gurm.
Yeah, if you're going to have that many letters, I'm going to pronounce them like an acronym. That's just how it works. It's okay.
But he was known as Tollers.
That's adorable.
Yes.
And I love that, and I love him, but we are getting distracted. You're not allowed to speak on The Hobbit just yet, Sarah, because you have not told me something good that's happened lately.
Something good that happened this week is I went to the Winchester Mystery House, which was fun.
Ooh.
I mean, I don't believe in the ghost stuff. Like, no, ghosts didn't tell her to build a stairway to nowhere. That happened because there was an earthquake and she decided not to rebuild. But the architecture was great. There was a lot of really beautiful stained glass in the house, and I really enjoyed the tour.
I mean, not believing the ghost stuff is what makes it so fun.
Yes.
In my opinion. I've done a few haunted tours in my day, and it's really fun to watch people's faces when you do shit you're not supposed to do. Like, I don't know. Like, what's an example? Say Bloody Mary, or, ooh, people who really care about Ouija boards. I quite enjoy fucking with them. Anyway, I hope you had a lot of fun on the tour going, oh no, this corner of the house is really cold.
I did not do that. But if we go back and do their seance tour, maybe then.
Oh my God. See, the problem is I would play into it so hard. It would be no fun for anyone but me. You're welcome.
I mean, I'd have a great time if I was there.
Oh, good. My good thing is much more founded in the physical realm. We discovered that one of the tomato plants we had planted is actually a lemon boy variety, which we knew we had planted a lemon boy, but we thought that was one of our miniature tomato varieties. And it turned out that it was actually one of our adult tomato varieties, which only matters because we then realized we had like a bazillion tomatoes that are actually ripe because they're, a gorgeous deep yellow and they weren't getting any redder. And it turns out that they were all ready to go. So we went from having a couple of big tomatoes to having 3 buckets of tomatoes in one day.
That is delightful. I was going to ask how you didn't realize that you had planted like that variety of tomato, but then you clarified. Mm-hmm. And so my questions were gone.
Yeah.
And I'm very happy for you.
Because we did have a miniature orange tomato it's called like sun sugar or something.
Yeah.
And so we assumed that was the lemon boy because we forgot.
What are you going to do with all of your tomatoes?
Well, we've been eating them. Ooh, we've been making tomato toast, which is like garlic butter and cheese and tomatoes. I guess we just recreated flatbread.
A little bit.
But it's very good.
There's a great recipe for tomato sauce in the first Final Detective book that I can give you if you want.
I will want, because the tomatoes are still coming. But we've made soup and we have several buckets set aside because this weekend we are going to attempt tomato wine. And we'll see how that goes.
That's very exciting.
It is. Thank you.
I hope it goes well.
Me too. Otherwise, we wasted like 8 pounds of tomatoes.
Yeah, that's a little sadder than me wasting a bunch of lemons on lemon wine that did not work out.
I mean, you have to try. What are you drinking tonight? Not lemon wine, it sounds like.
Not lemon wine. I'm drinking cider.
Oh, good. It is a beautiful September evening. I don't know about you, but it's gotten like a little overcast up here. It's definitely a cider night.
It definitely is a cider night here too. I mean, to be real, like most nights are cider nights in my house, but...
Except for the wine nights.
Except for the wine nights and the whiskey nights and the vodka nights and the water nights too.
Now I'm imagining like knights jousting, but they're like the whiskey night versus the wine night.
Yes. I mean, that's how I decide what I'm going to drink. is I watch a jousting match.
And the night who wins, that's the night that you have.
Yep.
Ooh, that got dirty fast. All right. It's also a cider night for me, except I am thrilled because it is in season for Schilling's Cider to bring their chider back, which is still the worst word I've ever heard in my life. But it's
not that bad.
It sounds like chowder.
It's not that bad.
I don't want to think about chowder when I'm drinking cider.
It sounds like chai and cider, which is what it is.
It's delicious.
You're just wrong about the name. You're right about it being delicious, but I think you're wrong about the name.
It's a spiced chai cider, and it's very, very good. And it's seasonal, so I have to enjoy it while it's here.
Indeed.
Mm-hmm. All right, enough about that. This is a book podcast. Sarah, have you read anything good lately?
I'm still having trouble reading anything but novellas, but I have read a couple of novellas. I read Valley of the Free by Michael Slider, which is, I guess, a prequel novella to his Pandemonium Rising series. I don't think that the main series, which I have not read, focuses really at all on the main character who appears in the novella, but it was good. It's grimdark, so not quite my genre. There's a lot of, I don't really want to call it gratuitous violence, but there's a lot of violence.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's grimdark, so.
Yeah. And characters who are, if not morally bankrupt, at least morally very gray. So not my general thing, but it was very well written. I did like some of the characters, and I enjoyed the novella, even if it's not my genre of choice.
And we can still enjoy things that aren't necessarily our jam.
Yeah.
And that just makes it even specialer.
I don't know if I would be able to read the full book or the series.
But the novella is just a little taste.
But the novella was the right length.
Yeah.
I enjoyed the novella.
Well, wonderful. I'm glad to hear that.
Have you read anything lately?
Sarah, I was tricked.
Why were you tricked? How were you tricked?
I found a fan fiction that sounded good, and it was 46,000 words, which is on the long side for me for fan fiction.
I was going to call it moderate. But
no, for me, though. That's not usually the length that I read. But it sounded good, and I figured I could just stop reading it if I didn't like it, which I guess is technically always true. But if it's short, I'll finish it anyway, just because, I don't know, why not?
Yeah.
So I read it. It was good. And then I realized it was the first part in a series. I was like, okay, all right, let's see what's next. The second part is only 5,000 words.
That's not bad.
And I was like, great, okay, let's go. So I read a couple of parts. The next one was 6,000, 12,000. And then the next one's 109,000. Sarah, I finished the 109,000, which is part 5 of the series.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was like, how is there another one after this? And I finally looked at the series. 38 works long.
Okay,
it's how 900,000 words.
Is it complete?
I don't know how you tell with a series. Does it say? Oh, complete? No. It tells me the answer's no. To be fair, the author is very good. And each piece does have an ending and wrap up, which means at the end of the 109,000 word story, I did say that's enough.
See, I would be thrilled to find something that had works that were that long and had 38 of them, because that would mean my reading for the next 2 weeks was set. It would be great.
Okay, we'll circle back on this later, because that's not what this is about.
That is not what this is about.
What this is about is The Hobbit by J.R.R. or Tollers. Although I feel like you have to actually be his friend to call him Tollers.
Probably. I think that was what the Inklings called him.
Oh yeah, I'm not. I wish. Holy shit, I wish.
I don't know if other people called him Tollers or not, but I know that the Inklings did. Warnie Lewis, who is C.S. Lewis's brother, has a lot of letters about Tollers.
Oh, that's the sweetest thing. This is not actually an Inklings episode either, though. This isn't even a Middle Earth episode, and we're not going to speak about Rings of Power. I'm drawing that line. Good vibes only in this episode.
Yes.
We'll see how long that lasts, but that's where we're starting. We're going to be discussing The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I've listened to this on audiobook a lot, but I reread it in actual physical form. It's been a long time. I didn't realize how long it's been since I've read this book.
Yeah, I don't know when the last time I read The Hobbit was. It's been a couple of years, to be sure.
Confession time. I definitely watch the movie more often than the movies more often than I read the book. But that's because I can multitask when I watch the movies, whereas when I read a book, I have to just sit down and read a book. And unfortunately, sometimes I have to do other shit. And then I can have the movie on in the background, and then I rewatch The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings a lot.
I mean, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's much easier to multitask with a movie. I guess you could do that with an audiobook. You don't get the visual component.
Yeah, for some reason, that's harder for me to pay attention to, which does not actually make sense now that I think about it.
I mean, I can't listen to audiobooks because I need to be doing something like that doesn't require brain power, something like knitting that doesn't require brain power, but that like keeps me occupied.
Focused, yeah.
But I don't have the free time to do that. So the end result is that I just never listen to audiobooks.
They're very good for driving for me. But you don't drive, so that kind of takes that out.
And I don't commute anymore either.
Yeah.
If I was still commuting, I would probably listen to more of them.
The first time I read The Hobbit was actually, I guess I didn't read it. I guess it was technically an audiobook because my parents read it out loud to me when I was an extremely tiny child. It was definitely in, quote unquote, the new house. You know how you like the houses you lived in for like 50 years, but it's the one that you moved to when you were 4 years old. So it's still the new house. It wasn't quite 50 years, but high school feels like it. So I was definitely very, very young. I think I was 5.
My father gave me a copy of The Hobbit when I was, I think, like 5 or 6. There's an inscription on the hardcover copy of the book, which is not what I read, so I can't look at it right now, where he wrote the date. But he gave me a copy of it for a birthday when I was young. And then he was so enthusiastic about me reading it that I just refused to. I was like, no, you want me to read this so badly? Too bad. I'm not touching it at all. Until finally I read it, but I was like 11 by that point.
I feel like there are some scenes that still unsettle me today, purely because when I was 5 years old, they freaked me the fuck out.
I mean, that's valid. I think that's valid.
And I don't think, well, you were a mature and level-headed 11-year-old, so I'm sure you didn't have that experience.
Not quite. I don't, at least not that I remember. I mean, my memory is pretty shit just in general, but I didn't feel particularly unsettled when I read the book this time.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming that I didn't feel particularly unsettled when I read it the first time, at least nothing that stuck with me like that.
Well, before we continue, I'm going to actually remember to give the spoiler warning instead of having to edit it in afterwards. We are going to be talking about The Hobbit in its entirety and adaptations, etc., surrounding The Hobbit. So if you haven't read it, you know what happens. It's The Hobbit.
Unlike our normal episodes, we're not splitting this up into a non-spoiler and spoiler section. So consider yourself warned.
Yeah, so when Gandalf kills the goblins in Goblin Town, for some reason, reading that today as a grown-ass adult, I was like, ugh. Cannot explain it except that it freaked me out when I was little.
I can see how it would be freaky for like a 5-year-old.
Yeah, and it just, like, that has imprinted on my psyche. Now that scares me, even though it's not scary. There's not much in this book that's actually scary.
Yeah, it definitely is very much a fairy tale where bad things happen, but they're not really like enumerated or like heavily dwelled upon.
I mean, so there's okay, let's just spoil shit right up top. I warned you already. 3 of the dwarves in the company, that's what, a fifth, roughly 1/5 of Thorin's company, including Thorin himself, die in the final battle, which is completely glossed over in more of a like, shucks, that sucks.
Yeah, like, I mean, you are there kind of for Thorin's death, But because Bilbo is knocked out and doesn't see any of the action, it feels very removed. And like Fili and Kili are just a side note. Like later, like Thorin's dead. We get a scene with him and Bilbo, and then like 5 pages later, oh yeah, Fili and Kili died in the battle too.
Well, that's because the dwarves are just the dwarves, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But even during the adventure to get to the Lonely Mountain, there are times when their lives are in danger, but it doesn't feel that, I don't know, Bilbo's going to survive. And part of that's because the way the narration of the book is, Tolkien does a ton of foreshadowing just in the way he speaks of events, which makes a pretty cool vibe. The narration of this book, I mean, this might surprise you, but I really like Tolkien as an author.
No way.
I do wonder, though, is this book technically in second person point of view?
I don't think so, because the book is talking to the reader. The reader is not like the one experiencing the action.
Okay, fair enough. The action is driven by a character ascribed to the reader.
Yeah.
So even though you are reading this book and Tolkien speaks directly to you, you're not the one driving the action. Fair enough.
Yeah.
It is kind of wild reading a novel, though, and have the narrator talk directly.
I mean, but that contributes to the very fairy tale, like old-fashioned vibe of the book.
Oh, this is such a children's story, which is not like a revolutionary stance to take, but it's so interesting when you think about it in the wider works of Tolkien, which is so mythological and has much higher stakes, although the good guys do still tend to win. I'm much more sad. Oh, we can spoil Lord of the Rings too, right? That's fine.
I mean, I think it depends on how big of a spoiler, but consider yourself warned. This is just general Tolkien spoilers abound.
It's much rougher when Boromir dies in Lord of the Rings than when the dwarves die in The Hobbit.
I think that's because we spend a lot more time both with Boromir as a character, but with like his death scene.
And we see people mourn him. Like none of the dwarves seem to care, or if they do it off page.
We see Bilbo mourn Thorin.
For like a paragraph.
I mean, he says he went off and had a good cry, essentially. And like, that's all of it.
Boromir gets 3 songs in a row.
Yeah.
Which is a whole other thing.
I'm going to go on record. I liked the songs in The Hobbit. I like Tolkien songs. I was happy with them.
In The Hobbit. The ones in Lord of the Rings are too long. That's not what we're talking about.
I do tend to read those too, but I won't argue about that because I haven't reread Lord of the Rings in a while. So
anyway, the point is, even when bad stuff happens, it doesn't put you through the emotional ringer. And you know that Bilbo makes it back home just because of the way everything is phrased. And yeah, it's just a very easygoing book. It's just like a journey.
Yeah, I think another thing for me that contributes to it feeling very much like a fairy tale is the fact that all of these things are happening to Bilbo. He's not necessarily choosing any of that.
Oh, yeah. He doesn't make a single decision until like 3/4 of the way through the book.
Yeah. On the other hand, that makes his character growth or arc feel a lot more, I don't know, earned. Like you really cheer when he starts acting for himself and like standing up for himself and doing things because you're like, yes, you have been so passive like the entire book. It's so nice to see you, kill spiders.
Which is the other scene that has really stuck with me since I was a child, probably because it's his first like triumphant moment. It's the first time that Bilbo does something for himself. Until then, he's just entirely swept along. And even the scene with Gollum, which is one of the more iconic scenes in the book, I would argue, even if it's gone through a million changes. The riddles in the dark, Bilbo doesn't even actually beat Gollum.
I keep meaning to. So I have John Rateliff's The History of the Hobbit, which has a version of the original chapter in it. And I keep meaning to go and read that just to compare and see how different like the revised version is. But I haven't gotten around to it yet.
Everything I know about the original scene is from the extras on the extended edition Lord of the Rings DVDs. when Fran and Philippa talk about that. So I also have not read the original, but yeah, Bilbo can't even beat Gollum at a riddle match, even though, well, there's a lot of stuff about the ring, which is why he claims that he won it fair and square, right? Although that's kind of retconny. So much about this book.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, I think that's retcon.
The whole scene is retcon.
Yeah, the whole scene is retcon.
But that's one of the like really striking moments that everyone knows. Everyone knows those riddles, right? Even if you haven't read the book or seen the movies. But Bilbo wins by cheating. And then he complains about Gollum cheating. And it's like, my dude, you did that way first.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add there. I will say, changing subjects just a little bit, the older I get, the more I relate to Bilbo and his horror when he has 13 dwarves show up on his doorstep with no warning and he has to host them. And he's like, but I don't have the food for that. I'm not ready for that. And I'm like, Bilbo, I understand. I too would be horrified if I had 13 people show up at my house unexpectedly and I had to host them and feed them and all of that.
13 strangers.
Yeah. Like, how horrible.
That moment is so played for laughs, right? Like, oh, Bilbo, he's so funny and overwhelmed. But yeah, thinking about it for even a moment, you're like, oh my God, actually a horror story.
I'm the kind of person who complains when I have like one person unexpectedly show up at my house. So I cannot even imagine having 13.
There's also when Gandalf says, oh, Bilbo, what took you so long? I thought you would have left right away. And it's like, he took so long because he was cleaning up. You can't just leave dirty dishes. Okay, I leave dirty dishes in my house all the time, but not for months to go on an adventure. Can you imagine the like actual shit show he would come home to if he just left dirty dishes on the table for a year?
It would be so bad. Like, I don't even like leaving dirty dishes on the table for, 12 hours.
Oh, yeah. See, you and I are somewhere in between Bilbo, who cleans up immediately, and Gandalf, who expects him to leave it for a year. I will let the listener imagine where I am on that spectrum, but it's somewhere in between those two things.
Also, can I just say that, man, how rude is it of Gandalf to just like put scratches in Bilbo's nice, freshly painted door?
Oh, Gandalf's such an ass.
Yeah, like as an adult who cares about my house or the place that I live, I'd be so pissed. I just painted that thing.
And Gandalf and the dwarves are sort of ribbing Bilbo for being scared. But it's like, that's a motherfucking dragon. His fear is extremely reasonable. I also would rather not get incinerated, actually.
What a concept.
But when you're little and you're reading it, you're like, yeah, go on the adventure. What's wrong with you? And then he goes and you're like, yeah, I was right. But no. Bilbo is just having a tookish moment, as they say.
Like I said, the older I get, the more I like Bilbo as a character and relate to him. And like also just how ultimately he enjoys the adventure, which probably, is a thing, but he's so happy to get home. And I relate to that too.
Well, it can be both. I relate to it being both. We spoke about this off air, about how sometimes you have to convince yourself to be excited for plans because you'll enjoy it when you get there.
Yeah, like I'm not saying that it's impossible to be genuinely excited for being on an adventure when you're on it, but like the longer it goes on, I find, and I'm not adventures specifically because I don't I've never gone to go slay a dragon.
Yeah, my definition of an adventure is trying a new grocery store. So.
Yeah, leaving the house. The longer it goes on, the happier you are to get home, which really comes through in Bilbo.
Mm-hmm. He really is a well-written character, if you think about it. And probably the only consistent thing in this book. It is his character. And while he does grow in his self-assuredness and risk-taking, he's still himself the whole time. And everything else in this book is sort of just set dressings for Bilbo to learn how to trust himself, which is kind of also what makes it a kid's story, right? Like, hey, it's okay to take risks and go on adventures, and everything will be okay because Dad Gandalf will be there to help you. Is it apocryphal that Tolkien wrote this book by like making it up for his son as a bedtime story, or is that real? I'm not sure.
I'm pretty sure that that's real.
Because I believe it wholeheartedly.
I mean, he definitely started it writing on the back of a student's like exam paper.
Good for him. Everything about Tolkien I love so much. I know the second I say that and I publish it in a podcast, something terrible will happen, but I have faith that it won't for Tolkien.
I mean, I think that Tolkien's long enough dead and his writings well enough public that if he had any deep, dark secrets, they probably would have appeared by now.
Well, they aren't deep, dark secrets, but his absolute sassy moments in this book. There are some very good ones in Lord of the Rings as well, but that's not what I read for this.
It's funny. It's been a while since I've read Lord of the Rings, so I don't remember sassy moments in that. And it had been a while since I'd read The Hobbit, but I read his letters within the last year, so it's recently enough. And he's so sassy in that. And it makes sense that the Tolkien who wrote those letters, which are full of sass, is the Tolkien that wrote The Hobbit, which is also full of sass, which I did not remember from my last reread.
It's toned down in The Hobbit, I would say. It's definitely a kid-friendly version of sass. But he still gets his like savage remarks in there, and it's so good.
Yeah, he pops off at times, and it's brilliant.
We read different versions, so our page numbers are completely different. But I think we should just take a moment to share some of our noteworthy Tolkien jokes. I'm saying jokes because I have the golf quote in here, which isn't sassy so much as like absurd and hilarious. But I think people forget that he has such a good sense of humor. Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth is this expansive universe with so much lore, and he invented so many languages, and he's so smart that you forget he's also fucking hilarious.
Yeah, I think people remember the antiquated language and forget the humor.
Mm-hmm.
I know that I'm, guilty of that.
Especially when you're watching the movies as often as I am. And again, frankly, more often than I'm reading the books, because it is faster and I can multitask. Sorry. You lose his prose, which is rough, not rough, hard, different. It's beautiful, but hard to read. Like you have to actually focus to digest what's happening. Or at least I do. I don't know. Maybe some people can just read it in their sleep.
I would just say different.
I mean, it's not the Canterbury Tales. Like, I took a class in Middle English. It's not that hard, but it's not, True Blood either. You have to focus on the prose. You can't just tune in every once in a while.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of the times, I mean, and there's humor in the movies, but a lot of the times it's not, well, we should save this for the adaptation portion of our conversation.
And we weren't even supposed to talk about Lord of the Rings tonight, so
yeah, we were not supposed to talk about Lord of the Rings. This is Hobbit talk only.
Well, in The Hobbit, I think all of our notes are about him making fun of rich fuckers.
Basically.
Comparing them to Smaug, the evilest dragon in the world, just by default is scathing.
He's got some absolutely savage commentary, which is just great. I mean, it's so much fun to read him be just absolutely, like you say, scathing.
People considered the Bagginses very respectable, not only because most of them were rich, but also because they never had any adventures or did anything unexpected. And that, right away, that's the very first page. Just, yeah, being rich makes you respectable. These are the values of these people. Isn't that ridiculous? And I know that that's a more understated one, but that's the first goddamn page of the book.
The quote that I particularly enjoyed is talking about Smaug and how angry he is when Bilbo steals something from him. And Tolkien writes that he was the sort of rage that is only seen when rich folk that have more than they can enjoy suddenly lose something that they have long had but have never before used or wanted.
That was the same quote I picked. We just had different page numbers.
Ah.
Oh, we thought we had two different quotes, but yeah.
I had that quote written out in our notes document. You probably should have noticed that it was the same quote by now.
I was eating dinner when we did the notes.
Yeah, but you wrote down what page number your quote was on when my quote was already there.
That was on a different line.
It was right underneath.
Well, that's a distraction from how very, very good that quote is.
It's very good.
This isn't scathing commentary, and it's in the movies, so I'm sure everyone knows it, but it's like 5 fucking sentences long. I'm not going to do that to you. Listen to the audiobook if you want to hear the quote about the invention of golf. That's just silly. It's just so absurd and ridiculous and lighthearted. And it just makes me happy.
I feel like this book in general just makes me happy.
It is very sweet and comforting. And I wonder how much of that is just nostalgia factor, remembering listening to it when I was very, very young, and how much of that is the book being very good. I'm sure it's some parts each.
I'm sure there's a little bit of both, but I don't have quite the same. Obviously, I have nostalgia factor for this. I can't say I don't.
11 is still pretty young.
11 is still young, but it's not 5 being read to by my parents.
Yeah. I remember being so pissed when they were like, now you read. And I was like, no, that's not the point. I can barely do that. What's wrong with you?
But yeah, I mean, I feel like it's just genuinely a very fun, comforting, high stakes, but in a low stakes feeling, if that makes sense.
Okay, I think what we are touching on is that the plot of the novel is not necessarily the tone of the novel.
Yes.
Even though the adventure that our characters are on, Bilbo and the dwarves, and I mean, we know what Gandalf is doing, and that's also extremely high stakes, even though we don't hear about it at all in this book.
And that's also kind of retconned.
I mean, yeah, but by Tolkien, so he can do whatever he wants.
Right, by Tolkien.
That is very high stakes. Their lives are in danger most of the book. But the novel itself is such a lighthearted, airy, silly, jokey journey that you never feel worried for the characters. You're never tense, or that's not true. Like I said, the Goblin Town fucked me up. But just the fact that there are these little moments that get you instead of being scared for your life for 300 pages is, I would say, masterfully done on Tolkien's part.
Yeah, and I also think that part of that has to do with the fact that the worst bits of the journey are given the least amount of page time.
Yeah, he never dwells in the misery.
Yeah, we get a lot about how, the dwarves are staying with Bjorn and eating honey and bread.
Is it pronounced Bjorn?
How are you pronouncing it?
Beorn.
I don't know.
I don't know either. Bjorn makes me think of Bjork.
Anyway, Tolkien dwells on the happy things.
Yes.
And he doesn't gloss over the bad aspects of the journey, but he definitely devotes a lot less page time to them. It's more like, this happened, but now we're at a happy part again.
And even when he is explaining the villains, the goblins, for example, have a lot of songs about crunching dwarf bones or whatever it is. But that in itself is kind of ridiculous. You're listening to them singing about these awful things, but because it's still that one step removed, you know that the goblins are bad guys without having to actually see them do anything mean or bad.
Yeah, hearing how they're bad guys versus seeing how they're bad guys.
Exactly. And so you still know, and because they're saying it about themselves and they're proud of it, you're like, oh yeah, that these are super bad guys. But you're never in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
We never see a dwarf get eaten by goblins because holy shit, that's pretty grimdark.
I think, if Tolkien, well, not if Tolkien, because I don't think Tolkien would ever write grimdark, but if the story of The Hobbit was written today, I do think that it would be very grimdark.
Oh, we're not talking about the movies yet. Okay, I will restrain myself.
We're not talking about the movies yet.
Tolkien is maybe one of the best world builders in the entire history of the English language. He is not consistent at all, and it's so funny. We've already talked about how he rewrote this book. I don't think that's fair to hold against him because this was his first work, and then he expanded the world from it. And yeah, of course, you're going to think of other stuff and want to go back and fix things that you did before.
It was his first novel of Middle-earth. I think that he had written some poetry that he later involved or later incorporated into the world of Middle-earth.
I'm going to say that counts. Yeah, this is the first story that takes place there. Poetry is fantastic, but you don't need consistent world building for a good poem.
But this was definitely his first novel of Middle-earth.
Right. And you can tell he went back and rewrote it twice and was in the process of doing it when he passed away. It's a wonderful, fantastic children's story. It's not super representative of the Middle-earth that I am familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting how he was constantly revising his mythology. That's probably a whole other podcast, beyond the beyond the scope of this conversation.
But we get to see it in some really neat, concrete ways. Because the elves are fairies, basically, in this book. And that's after he rewrote it a couple times. When you think about it, the fire circles, the feast circles that the dwarves stumble into in Mirkwood, that's a fairy ring. And the first person who walks in falls asleep and they have spooky dreams. The elves even mention going to the Fae realm. I think they call it the fairy at one point.
Tolkien is kind of consistent there. I don't think he ever really stops calling it fairy.
I don't think he does that in Lord of the Rings at all. I don't think he refers to fairies at all in Lord of the Rings.
Not in Lord of the Rings, but in his mythology, they're consistently linked.
Okay. Well, the fact that he doesn't do it in Lord of the Rings, which is the largest story that takes place in Middle-earth. You're making faces. Not years-wise in the story, but as far as actual books he wrote, that's the biggest one story beginning to end that takes place in Middle-earth.
It is the biggest published story, yes.
What's the unpublished story that has more words? And if it's just one story that has a bunch of different versions, that does not count.
No, I mean, I don't have...
I mean, he has a lot of work that's not Lord of the Rings, but they're all small chunks compared to it.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
The word fairy doesn't happen once in Lord of the Rings. I just referring to not the afterlife, the West, where the seagulls pick them.
Valinor?
Yeah, referring to that as the fairy just blew my fucking mind.
Yeah, I mean, he does refer to it as fairy multiple times in other things, so.
Well, I'll take your word for it. Doesn't happen in Lord of the Rings. And I have read that in the last 6 months, so I can say that.
It doesn't happen in Lord of the Rings. And maybe I'm getting confused and that's all early stuff. But he very much did have correlation.
He also has multiple versions of everything, right? So
yeah.
Elves are so silly in this book. They are much more stern in every other version of elves that I've read. Even when they party, it's more we're going to sing and sip wine, not we're going to carouse and make fun of you.
Yeah.
Tra-la-la-lolly, come back to the volley is a running gag in my family because that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I'm sorry, Tolkien. I think it's supposed to be, though.
I really like that song.
I think it's supposed to be stupid.
I like all of his songs in this.
I don't think I wrote the page down. Tra-la-la-lolly, come back to the volley. Unless you think it's tra-la-la-lally, come back to the valley. Oh, I guess he's British. Maybe it is tra-la-la-lally, come back to the valley.
I do think it's Lally.
Well, tra-la-la-lally sounds terrible. I hope that's not true.
But like the other lyrics in the two versions of that song that appear, like, yeah, it's silly, but I don't think it's bad.
Oh, tra-la-la-lally, the valley is jolly. It's just silly.
It is
It's
silly.
just so silly, and we don't see elves be this silly much, if at all, if ever.
They are definitely a lot more frivolous in this and lighthearted than they are in Lord of the Rings or like the Silmarillion.
Yeah, I feel like they quickly become, well, elves as we know them in popular culture, because God knows Tolkien just like created popular culture on the back of a napkin on a whim.
The back of a student's exam paper.
Yeah, and that's not fair. Like, he worked so hard on this. It like deserves to last this long. Even when people aren't purposefully referencing Tolkien, they still are on accident just because it has seeped into our reality.
Well, it really does feel like the backbone of a lot of modern fantasy, like, building off of the bones of giants, et cetera, et cetera.
And I shouldn't make fun of that because he worked so hard on this world and this universe. I'm going to make fun of it anyway, but just know that it's a loving, loving jab, like the elves. I am saying Trilililolly, the valley is jolly at Tolkien, and I think he would be okay with that. It doesn't matter because he's dead, so he doesn't have to be okay with it.
I mean, Tolkien's not going to be listening to our podcast.
You're not going to tweet it at him.
Nor will Christopher Tolkien, who is also dead at this point.
Okay, we have strayed very close to talking about adaptations, but we're not there yet. First, we gotta make fun of the dwarves. Not the dwarves as a race, because Tolkien does that enough for us, frankly. Justice for dwarves.
I mean, the dwarves do feel a little bit, the dwarves as a race do feel a little bit like the younger stepchild in Tolkien's mythology in general.
That's literally what happened to them, too. They were created when they weren't supposed to be.
Yeah.
And so they got, anyway, not what we're talking about. I do think fandom for Middle-earth overall, especially the Hobbit movies, has sort of felt that and then created this like really vibrant dwarven culture based on little things.
That was a huge part of our conversation with Ciel Pirlo about Lord of the Rings fan fiction.
Yes, and I still believe it, and that's still not what we're talking about.
That is still not what we're talking about now.
No, we are giving shit to Tolkien for having 12 different dwarf characters. Gandalf was the 15th one, so there's 13 dwarves.
I believe so.
There are 13 dwarves, and 90% of the dialogue is blah blah blah, the dwarves said.
I'm just imagining all 13 dwarves in unison,
Perfect unison in coordinated time saying, but Bilbo, you can't be serious, or whatever it is. That's ridiculous. And not in the fun way. That's just like, no wonder no one can keep the dwarves straight. You don't have to. They're one dwarf.
I mean, basically, yes.
And that's pretty, I don't know. I'm not going to say a bummer.
But the dwarves aren't why you read The Hobbit.
The Hobbit is why you read The Hobbit.
Yeah.
It's true.
It is a bummer that we have all of these characters and we get some glimpses of them that are very interesting. And I think we'll talk more about this when we finally get into our adaptation conversation.
I think we have to, right? Because, and when you compare it to Lord of the Rings, which is not an adaptation, so I can bring it up right now, you hear so much about how elves are these, like, perfect celestial beings who have deigned to grace Middle-earth with their presence. And then it's like, dwarves dig in the dirt. They like gold too much. And that just feels bad.
Not even that, but like in the Lord of the Rings, the company, the fellowship, all of the members are distinct and identifiable.
Mm-hmm.
And bits about their various characters. And you have what you could call a fellowship in The Hobbit, but it's the dwarves who are not distinct, except maybe for Thorin.
No.
Like, we get a bit about his character.
Barely.
We know that he's a little bombastic, that he's well-meaning, but he's like kind of full of himself.
Yeah, he's a little bit of a pompous ass.
Yeah.
But mostly in a harmless way.
Yeah, but like that's about all we know about him. And we don't really know anything about the other dwarves beyond their names. And we get Bilbo and we get Gandalf.
But even like Middle Earth as a whole, like we said, the very creation myth shits on dwarves.
I don't know if I would say shits on them, but they get shafted a little bit. I mean, they don't get the screen time that the elves do at all.
Is it okay? Now maybe I'm mixing up fanon with canon, but their creator made them too early, and so they Awe, whatever his name is. It's a lot of vowels. God.
Aule is their creator.
Aule is the creator, but then the big god wanted to destroy them because they got made too soon, but Aule was like, please don't. So then he just put them to sleep until after the elves, who are supposed to be the first ones, got created. And like just literally like automatically redheaded stepchild right there.
Yes. And I believe that is actually canon.
I'm pretty sure it is. I have a lot of opinions about like canon and fanon, but we're still not to the adaptation section yet. My point is, if this wasn't the first book he wrote in Middle Earth, I keep hesitating because I'm worried it's going to be like, no, there's actually this first one, but I'm pretty sure it is.
It is. I mean, like I said, some of his poetry he connected to Middle Earth, but this is the first like novel that he wrote.
This could have been an opportunity to create really interesting dwarven culture and characters, but he hadn't shat on them yet. So really, this is just par for the course. Dwarves are just kind of like, well, the elves need a foil.
The elves are not very distinguished in this book either.
That's true, but they get their time to shine, and the dwarves never really do.
Yeah, I mean, like he does develop them in later mythologies, but when you compare how he writes the dwarves in The Hobbit, looking specifically at The Hobbit, versus how he writes the elves, it's pretty even-handed.
Which is why I said, if this hadn't been the first book, and this was after he did all that elf stuff, this would have been the perfect opportunity to give dwarves their due.
Yes.
But because this came before that, there was no due to give.
Mm-hmm.
And so we just got the dwarves.
Yes. The collective.
Yeah. 13 people smashed down into they said.
That's a lot of characters to keep track of.
Well, he could have done fewer than 13 people.
Could have. Sure.
I hate to say it, but Oin and Gloin, they didn't need to be in there.
I mean, a lot of the dwarves don't really add anything to the storyline.
Bifur and Bofer, cut them. Keely and Keely don't do anything except die.
Not in the book, anyway.
Yes. Okay, are we finally going to talk about the movie? Because I'm dying.
Yes.
You ready to defend these movies with our lives?
Yes. These movies get shit on a lot. I have to say, having just reread The Hobbit, I actually think that the movies are a pretty good adaptation of the book, even as a trilogy. The pacing of The Hobbit is really weird if you try to make it not a fairy tale.
Mm-hmm.
Because you really do have three major battles, three major points that are given equal weight in the story. And so I can see why Peter Jackson decided to break it up.
I don't think it was his decision. Was it? Someone decided.
Someone decided. But I actually think that it makes sense because it gives you the time and the space to give the dwarves some individual like characters, make you care a little bit more about just everyone in the company and make them feel like individual characters who you will then worry for as the story progresses. And like, I honestly think that it works really well as a trilogy.
I have two responses to that. One of the biggest criticisms I've seen of the movies is that you can't tell the dwarves apart. And I just want to shake every person and say, they've improved it so much. Are you fucking kidding me? Have you even read the book?
Mr. Squeak agrees. Yeah, half those people read the books.
Clearly not.
The dwarves have so much more personality in the movies than they do in the books.
Okay, my second point is, If I had full creative control, it should have been a 1-season TV show. Each chapter could have been 20 minutes because it's so episodic. Like, I get what you mean about the 3 battles, or the 3 conflicts at least. And I get that. But the book itself doesn't feel like it builds those points as much as it's just sort of meandering through Bilbo getting garbage thrown at him. And that's such a perfect, not monster of the week exactly, but what shenanigans is Bilbo getting up to tonight? Like, that would have been really good.
I don't know.
Or it would have been more of a children's show.
It would have been more of a children's show. I think a TV show would have been closer in tone to the tone of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did with the movies was bring it more in line with Lord of the Rings.
I agree completely. They took the Hobbit story and were like, let's put this into the more like epic fantasy novel instead of goofy fairy tale. Like, tone, you said it. Yeah. I'm just repeating you now, but I agree with you.
and like sometimes, I mean, like, I think the elves got done dirty by doing that, because like Thranduil, the elven king, because he's not actually named in the book, like, he's not quite as mean as he is in the movies.
Oh, but he's so good.
I think it makes for a better storyline in a cinematic experience. Like, he needs to be an antagonist.
It makes for a more adult story.
Yeah.
Which I'm not saying that it's like fully pornographic, but Bilbo and Thorin were doing something off screen.
And even if you disagree there, I mean, it still makes for a more adult story just because it feels like the stakes are higher.
Yeah, I was making a joke about how adult and porn are synonymous and they shouldn't be. I agree. The movies were actually pretty damn accurate. The casting was phenomenal.
I was actually surprised at how accurate the movies were. Like, obviously, the movies include the Tauriel storyline, which is not there, and Legolas is not actually in the books. But
that's the kind of retconning, Legolas at least, is the kind of retconning that Tolkien would have done if he had gotten another stab at this book. I believe that.
Oh, yeah. Tolkien absolutely would have. Like, I'm not disagreeing there. But, like, in general, I was surprised at how accurate the movies felt compared to the book, reading it now.
I think because Tolkien himself retconned his own work so much, it's easier to engage with media that change things, because you're like, yeah, okay. You need to do a little fiddling to make stuff fit together better. That's fine. That's how Middle-earth is. You have to fiddle with it a little. Even Tolkien did.
Yeah, we said we weren't going to talk about Rings of Power, so I'm going to keep this brief. I agree with you, but I think that there is a level of fiddling that, like, makes sense.
Oh, my issue with Rings of Power is entirely the tone and the spirit, which you can't fix with a little plot fiddling.
Yeah, well, my point with Rings of Power is that because they don't have the rights to so much, I'm not convinced that they're fiddling
in good faith.
In good faith, yeah.
Yeah.
So, like, there are levels of fiddling that I personally can accept, and the Hobbit movies are at a level that I think makes sense with the world and is consistent with what Tolkien did himself, for the most part.
Look, I really enjoyed the Hobbit movies. They were like halfway to a shameless cash grab.
That's fun.
Yeah, but I'm saying you have one thing that's very successful. The original Lord of the Rings movie adaptations from 2001 or whatever, whenever the Fellowship came out.
Longer ago than it should have.
They're going to keep trying to recapture that, and every time they attempt, they're going to get a little farther away. Doesn't have to be true. Someone could come along with excellent motives and intentions and do a really fucking good job because they just truly love the story and want to see it on screen. But I don't think a big budget production is capable of having soul, because too many people are invested, literally invested, and you're not going to be able to have creators doing what they want. We're talking about Rings of Power, which we promised we wouldn't do.
I half agree with you. I mean, I think that it does make it more difficult when you have a big budget and a lot of non-Middle-earth fans who have a stake in the success of a thing. But I also think it's a lot easier to have a successful show when you have the rights to the story that you want to tell.
We can definitely talk all day about the story that Rings of Power is telling and the one that they clearly want to tell.
Yeah.
Those are two different stories. We are so distracted. We're talking about The Hobbit and how Toriel is good and no one can tell me otherwise. I don't give a fuck about Evangeline Lilly. Actresses and actors, this isn't a gender thing. They get no say in their character. They're not the writers. I don't care what they wanted for their character. And I know everyone's like, but she didn't want to be in a romantic plotline. I don't care. That doesn't make the plotline bad. That's about the treatment of actors and actresses in Hollywood, which is a different conversation from, is the character of Toriel bad and is her plotline bad? They are not. Everyone needs to go away.
Like, I'm indifferent to her for the most part, or to her character.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I would have been fine without her plotline, but I'm fine with her plotline too.
It's not bad. And everyone's like, okay, this is another example, not to talk about the Rings of Power again. People are wrong about why it's bad.
Yes.
Every criticism I hear is, but the actress didn't want to have a romance. Tough shit. That doesn't make the story itself bad. That's just politics. Get that garbage out of my story. Those are two completely different analyses.
That just means you need to vet the jobs you're taking better.
Well, if they sprung it on her, that's a fair criticism. But that's a criticism for the movie industry.
Yes.
Not the storyline. And I totally understand why the writers were like, hey, we might need a single female character in these movies. That's reasonable.
I agree. I would like to see more.
What they should have done is made half the dwarves ladies with beards. And they were cowards.
They should have done that and just not mentioned it.
Maybe they did and we don't know. Or actually, if they had cast women as the dwarves, that would have been incredible.
Yeah, like that's what I'm saying. They should have just cast women as the dwarves and just not mentioned it. I think my issue with Toriel's storyline is the fact that she is the only woman and she has a romantic subplot.
That's not true. Galadriel is in it.
Okay, but she's not an integral character. But like it feels like Toriel was there only to be a romantic interest, which I would like to see more characters just women vibing.
That's great, but we're still allowed to get, I'm not allowed. That's not the right, what am I trying to say? The romance plotline that we do get with Toriel is pretty wild.
Yes, I'm not like, this is two separate issues. I think that the romance plotline is fine, but it also simultaneously feels like she was only there to be a love interest. Like they thought, we need more women, so we're going to have a love interest.
I don't know if I feel the same way. I don't feel the same way.
I mean, that's fine. Like I can see how you would feel differently. That's how I feel. But like, I don't think that her plot line is inherently bad. It would not feel bad if there were more female characters in the book. I mean, in the movie. That's not a fault of the movie necessarily, because Tolkien does not write any women in this book whatsoever.
Not a single one.
Yeah, like there are no women in this book. So
okay, she does have a romantic plotline, but she has way more scenes with Legolas, with whom she is entirely platonic. And I know there's like, oh, it's a love triangle. That's not a love triangle.
It's not a love triangle. But it,
like, her scenes are not entirely her romance with Keeley. She has a lot of screen time that's not about him. It's about her hunting orcs.
It still feels, and I think maybe this is just my own baggage, but it feels like, because she is essentially the sole female character, yes, Galadriel's there, but
and kicks some fucking ass.
And Galadriel is there and kicks ass, but she's not central to the storyline at all, really. But like, it feels like because she is the main female character, she has to have a romantic plotline.
I think it's unfair to reduce her to her romantic plotline. She does a lot of other stuff, and saying none of that matters because she gets a boyfriend feels worse to me.
I'm not saying that none of it matters. It just feels like the showrunners, not showrunners because it wasn't a TV show, that like producers.
See, that's getting political again. If we're talking about her actual character and what her character does in the story, there's a lot that's not romantic happening.
If we separate out all of our baggage for things Yes, her character's fine.
Like, if we want to talk about Hollywood politics, that's a different conversation entirely, I think, or at least I think it should be. I get that that's not actually completely separate, but I think it's unfair to the character. Like, she does a lot of stuff that's not romantic.
Yes, and I would have liked, like, I don't know why they had to bring romance into it, because she does a lot of stuff that's not romantic. I'm also not anti-romance exactly, but like minimal romance.
Mm-hmm.
So I would have liked her better if she just had her like bro thing with Legolas.
I mean, and that's fine. You can say that you weren't into that part of the story, but that doesn't make the story bad.
No, and the story's not bad, but it also still feels to me like the producers thought, well, we need a female character and they have to have some romantic reason for being in the show, in the movie.
So I think that that's probably right, because like I said, the movies do feel like a cash grab to some extent, but it feels like, to me, we got a lot of feeling right now. There was supposed to be a love triangle, and someone said, well, how do we fuck that up? And I love that. They disrupted the basic love triangle story that we've seen in the Hunger Games and Twilight and so many popular trilogies. I guess not technically trilogies, but you know what I mean. And they went, okay, so let's have this kick-ass woman who has two different like male characters around her, and let's make it not a love triangle. And I think that's really wonderful. And just because it was almost a love triangle, or there was still a romantic element, doesn't make that other part less cool.
I think that's ascribing a lot more intention to the producers on like Legolas's part, on the non-romance part, than I ascribe to them.
Well, I mean, we don't know who said what. I'm saying I think someone said do romance, and then someone below them said, I'm a fuck with that. So I think someone probably said, yeah, there should be romance in here. And then someone said, well, how do we make that interesting? How do we show men and women being friends and not in a romantic relationship, which we don't see very often?
We don't.
And we got to see that.
I mean, I do think that like we do get a little bit of Legolas staring longingly at Tariel, but
he might have, but he was still willing to like go out of his way to save her boyfriend's life, which is even better.
He respects her boundaries. This is very true.
Like, and isn't that amazing? Like, when does that ever happen? He didn't throw a hissy fit about how you should be with me instead.
Yeah,
that doesn't great.
That doesn't happen often enough. I would like it a lot more if this plot line was not with the only female character, and there were other female characters who were having, you know, non-romantic relationships at all. But then you're saying Galadriel doesn't count. I'm saying Galadriel doesn't count. Galadriel doesn't show up enough to count. I want major female characters. Galadriel doesn't get the screen time.
I mean, her scenes are the best in the entire series. But that's just me having a big old crush on Galadriel.
But she doesn't get the screen time.
Yeah, but her screen time counts. No, you're right. We should have had more Galadriel. I agree.
Yes.
I'm going to assume that's your argument.
Yes. That is at least part of my argument. We should have had more Galadriel.
I mean, we get some unnamed female characters with the like Lake Town folk, but I agree that they don't really count. That's mean. They don't, though.
Do they have any on-screen lines?
Yeah. There's the woman who denies. Is his name Alfred? It's the non-Wormtongue character, probably the worst character. They're like the lackey, that awful lackey who's just like there for slapstick bad humor, and he didn't need to exist at all.
I was too busy trying to look for the pugs on screen to notice.
He's a big character. Like, he's the one who dresses in drag to escape.
Yeah, I mean, I vaguely remember him, but
he's not a minor character. He has a name and everything.
In my defense, it's been kind of a while since I've watched these movies.
Oh, we rewatch the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings movies at least twice a year.
Yeah, I watch them maybe like once every 3 years, so.
It's our New Year's ceremony. We time it so that one speech in Return of the King happens at midnight every year, which means we do have to start like 2 days ahead of time.
But that's a great tradition.
It's a great way to start the year. If they say, like, start the year doing what you want to be doing all year, I do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm all for this.
All right, so we've talked a lot about the Hobbit movies, about the elves specifically. We mentioned that the movies do a much better job of distinguishing the dwarves than the book even attempts to. And Thranduil is a lot more antagonistic in the movies, but Lee Pace isn't. Like, I'm okay with that. And Thorin is also a much more in-depth character, deep character, but then I'm saying like hashtag deep. His character has more depth. That's what I wanted to say.
I mean, we actually feel bad when he dies, which is kind of more than I can say about the books.
Yeah, a lot more, which I think was purposeful on the book's part because it's for children.
Yeah. And one of the things that I found really noteworthy was the fact that essentially what he says when he dies in the book versus when he dies in the movie is verbatim. You know, they like that's dialogue that they lifted straight out of the book. And in the movies, that hits you so much harder because you have such a better sense of this character and his motivations and his feelings for the characters around him. And like you've seen him be an asshole, but you've seen him kind of get over that and get to know Bilbo and maybe sleep with Bilbo if you're in that particular camp.
I don't think that that's even subtextual.
I mean, I don't necessarily ship them, but
I'm joking.
Yeah.
I don't in the book at all.
Yeah.
Like, I'm pretty sure Tolkien's Bilbo is ace.
Yeah, I can see that.
Movie Bilbo?
But that's my point. Like, you feel so much more for Thorin in the movies than you do in the books. That when he has the same speech that is kind of moving in the books, but you're like, okay, fine. It actually engenders so much more emotion when you watch it that, in fact, when I read it back today, because that's like I was finishing the book today, I was like, I'm crying because of how I feel when watching the scene in the movie, not because of what the book is making me feel, because the book I don't really feel for Thorin that much.
I agree completely. And Feely and Keely, like,
yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Their deaths are heartbreaking in the movie. All of the dwarves. I mean, okay, not all of the dwarves. There was still a lot.
And also, just shout out to Billy Boyd's song, The Last Goodbye, because like he does a great job. I cry at that song.
Billy Boyd has done some incredible music for the entire franchise.
Yeah.
Because his work in Lord of the Rings is also like...
is also great. Yeah, I agree.
We're not talking about that. We're talking about The Hobbit. And now we're done talking about the movies because I want to talk about fan fiction.
And you'll have to take the lead here because you read a lot more Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit fan fiction than I do.
Specific, very different. Lord of the Rings is perfect, and I don't want to read anything that changes it.
That's why I fixed myself. I corrected myself.
Yes. So there are some fanon elements. Do we have to describe what fanon is? I've already used the word like 10 times. Things in fan-created works that tend to show up over and over and become thematic, even if they weren't necessarily in the original work. What's a good example other than what I'm about to talk about? Because what I'm about to talk about is actually a bad example.
I don't know, because I've read very little Hobbit fan fiction. I've read like 20 chapters of Sansa.
Oh, not Lord of the Rings example. Oh, here's a good example. It's fanon that J.R.R. Binks is actually a Sith Lord. That's something that the fans have all banded together and decided is true, even though it's not actually necessarily in the original work.
That we know of.
That's what makes it fanon.
It could be confirmed.
Right.
We never know.
So you agree with me?
Yes.
I just wanted an example that people... Okay. There are some really fun elements of mostly the Hobbit cinematic universe. They don't call it cinematic universe, but AO3, the fanfiction website that I read the most.
Archive of Our Own.
Yes. Does differentiate between the books and the movies. So you can choose either based on the book, based on the movies, or all of the above. And Most of it is movies or all of the above. And there are some very fun little elements that have become universal within fan fiction that are actually from the book, but I don't think they necessarily know that. And I'm making assumptions, true. But when you read fan fiction, you can kind of get a vibe for like what the author is familiar with.
You do start to get a feel for that.
Especially for something like The Witcher that has so many different media attached to it. It's really interesting when you read an author who clearly has played the video games and they work like those mechanics into the story. That's not the point. The point is you can tell. And so there are some details that fan fiction authors have all decided are true and real and universal, such as the dwarves displaced from the Lonely Mountain had to make a living as blacksmiths or coal miners. And Thorin plays the harp, which is always kind of wild when it shows up in fan fiction. But they're actually from the book. And that's kind of fun because I feel like a lot of the fan fiction authors, I'm making this up, but I'm sure it's true for at least some of them, don't actually know that that's canon. It feels like it has become fanon just because these are throwaway details in the book. People are repeating them because they've seen them in other fan fiction works. And that's kind of a neat displacement of information. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how like these essentially headcanons, I don't want to call it headcanon because like you mentioned, this is actually something that is a detail given in the books, but it's interesting how this information propagates from fan fiction to fan fiction until it reaches a level where some people don't know the actual origin that's based in the books and think that it's just something that all of the fan fiction authors have accepted as true.
Yeah, exactly.
If I was an academic, I think this would be a really interesting academic field to pursue. I'm not an academic. I have no wish to write any kind of papers on this, but
there's got to be more studies on fan fiction or fanon and how information becomes universal like this because it's so cool.
Yeah. And just the way that you have one really popular fan fiction that gives it, and then all of these other authors read it and decide this is an aspect of the world that I really like and that I'm going to include in my work, and seeing how it just expands throughout the fan fiction. I find it fascinating.
Or like how Smaug's dialogue in fan fiction almost always is like a direct rip from Sherlock, the TV show.
That's because they're played by the same actor.
No, I know. Like that's not canon, but that's still something. Okay, I guess that's just a fanon. There we go.
Yeah.
That everything is decided is true. And it's not, the character voices are not that different. Smaug is kind of a pretentious douchebag, and so is Sherlock. So it fits really well.
Well, and you also get Smaug Bilbo fanfiction because of Sherlock. Like, I have seen that. I've not read it, but I know it exists. I've seen it. And it's there specifically because the same actors play those characters.
Right. I was talking about where that's not an element. Just any story where Smaug shows up, he tends to speak like Sherlock. And I mean, there's a lot more dialogue from Sherlock. So if you're trying to get a pattern, it's probably much easier to pick up just because there's a lot more of it.
Yeah.
I think that's just sort of a fun, almost like an Easter egg in stories where that's not the whole point, as you mentioned earlier.
I mean, I think fandom is really interesting as a whole. And the things that happen in fandom and how ideas disseminate and how character headcanons become fanon is just fascinating.
It does make me wish that I could do nothing but write essays all day. I'm doing research. Don't bother me, I say with the door shut, the lights off. Okay, speaking of information disseminating, and we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but this might surprise you, dear listener, but Middle Earth is very foundational for Western culture.
You don't say.
I know. I'm just throwing hot takes left and right. Even when people aren't trying to copy it, they still are, just because it is so embedded in our experience as fantasy readers, if nothing else. And one of the things that kept coming up for me over and over again while I was reading this book was how halflings in Dungeons and Dragons are still 100% Bilbo Baggins from The Hobbit. I mean, Dungeons and Dragons has gone through several iterations. It's been decades, but halflings are still Bilbo. There's even a line on my page 142 that says Bilbo did something because of the luck he was just born with. And halflings have, in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, have a natural feature where they are lucky, which means they get 1 reroll per day because they just are lucky. And like, that's Bilbo right there. Like, it's in the text.
Bilbo definitely feels like he rolls a lot of natural ones and then has the ability to like reroll.
Yeah. So I think halflings can naturally do it once per day, but if you take the feat lucky, you can do it 3 times per day. And I believe that does stack. So Bilbo has gone all in on the lucky feat.
And it's worked for him.
Yeah. He also has a very high dexterity. He's good at throwing things, which is 100% accurate. Like, I'm just saying, the mechanics still follow this children's fairy tale from 100 years ago? Close to? Not actually. I know I'm off a little bit.
You are off a little bit.
That voice reader was me seeing Sarah start to pick up her book to fact check to me.
1937.
Okay, we're a little ways off.
So like 80 years.
That's still a long time.
85 years, maybe.
I feel comfortable declaring that that's a pretty long time.
I will not fact check you on that.
Thank you. We also have the existence of wereworms, only mentioned
in a throwaway line
at the very beginning. It's not even in the Battle of Five Armies, which is where they show up in the movies. But in the movies, they're like squirmy earthworms, but with like big teeth. And I'm pretty sure in the book, they're actually dragonborn, which is also a D&D thing. I'm just saying. I'm just throwing that out there. This is more proof that I'm right.
I mean, we don't know either way, because we just get basically that one line, wereworms, and that's it. But I would like to think that they are basically dragonborn, yes.
Well, otherwise, it's a human with an earthworm head. Like... Were, as in the prefix of werewolf being man, worm either refers to dragons or worms. We have a whole conversation later planned for you, our dear listeners, about how we're pretty sure worms mean dragons and not squiggly things in the ground. Quid pro quo, werewolves are dragonborn.
My headcanon is that they're dragonborn. I don't think that we necessarily have enough information either way, but that's my headcanon.
Well, out of all the things Tolkien is very inconsistent about, his use of worm is pretty consistent.
Yeah, but I don't think he ever talks about wereworms ever again.
No.
Beyond this one line.
Yeah. Oh, you know what we never did because we didn't have a pre-spoiler section.
Why should you read this book?
Yeah, fucking read it. Get over yourself. It's silly. It's not like super deep, but that's fine. Not everything has to be.
It is a delightful fairy tale if you're looking for something to take you away from the harsh realities of the world and you want something that's fantasy. It has danger, but like you're kind of always at a remove from it. And you want a foundational fantasy work, or even if you just want something comforting.
Or if you're trying to interact with a child, which terrifies the best of us. I mean, this book is a kid's book.
Just make sure that you don't push too hard that they read this book. Otherwise, they will refuse for years.
In my head, I was imagining reading out loud to them, but I think that is just our biases showing through immensely.
Yes.
Our personal experiences.
Yes. My poor father. I mean, he was right. Like, he kept saying, you'll really like this book. You should read this book. I want you to read this book. You'll love it. And he was absolutely right. And I am comfortable saying that because he'll never listen to this episode. So it's fine.
No, poor Uncle Frank.
I mean, I give him shit for not being right, but he was right in this one case.
Well, as his daughter, you should.
Yes.
As his niece, I get to feel bad.
Yes. But like, just, boy, I was a stubborn little child when I mean, nothing has really changed. So
I'm going to quote you on that.
You're welcome to. I stand by my words.
Tolkien is a master wordsmith, but sometimes his choices make me giggle a little bit. Part of that is because words are weird, and part of that because language changes over time, and that's kind of what makes words weird. We're not going to talk about how the elves put Thorin in thongs, because I'm an adult and I don't laugh about the word thongs being used to refer to something other than underwear. But we're going to talk about worms.
I honestly didn't find that as funny as you did, so.
Because I didn't find it funny, because I'm an adult and I'm not going to laugh about it on the podcast for 10 minutes. I just said that, Sarah.
You're just going to laugh about it to me for 10 minutes. I see how that is. Anyway, yes, worms are weird.
Worms are weird. Tolkien uses the word worm to refer to dragons multiple times in this book. And I, as an avid fantasy consumer, am pretty used to the word wyrm, worm, W-Y-R-M, to refer to dragons. If it's a Dungeons and Dragons monster manual, maybe it's a specific type of dragon or something. I'm used to that. But the word worm still makes me think of the little wriggly thing. And we had to look it up because what? I suspected, well, what was my guess? We've already found the answer, so now I'm just exposing myself. Worm and snake, I think, used to be more interchangeable. It was just like thing without legs.
We did not do a super deep dive into it, but we did see that it comes from the Old English worm with a U, which is a variant of worm with a Y, meaning serpent, snake, dragon, or reptile.
I'm pretty sure there's definitely some crossover because of things without legs.
Possibly. That's not as far as our research went.
That's fine. I'm making shit up from when I took a class on the Canterbury Tales. I like it much better with a Y because then it feels spooky and fantasy.
It definitely feels fantasy with a Y. I agree.
Whereas with an O, you're like, that's a small friend I find in my garden.
Yes.
Tolkien uses it so sincerely to refer to Smaug, the terrible worm.
Well, and it makes sense because, he was an Old English and Middle English scholar. That was his, playground.
But why wouldn't he keep the Y? That's just his choice to make my life harder.
Yes.
He did that specifically to fuck me up.
Yes, it was specifically thinking, I know that Lily is going to be reading this in 85 years. Not 85, because you read it sooner. I know that Lily is going to be reading this in 70 years.
Oh, thank you.
How can I
just did some really fast math. That's very sweet of you.
I'm not doing math.
You should have just avoided it. You should have said, in a number of years.
Okay. A number of years. Now I'm distracted.
I shouldn't have fucked with you. I'm sorry.
You shouldn't have. Basically, yes. He wanted to make it as difficult for you as possible.
I mean, it did make me laugh. I feel like that is actually something he would do.
I feel like he probably would. I mean, maybe not you specifically, but I feel like he would be happy to kind of fuck with people.
Yeah, if he knew that he could pick between two different spellings and one of them would make people giggle because of the little squirmy friends and the other one would be, appropriately terrifying, he would definitely pick the one that would make me giggle.
Agreed.
There are, of course, also the wereworms, which are off the cuff referenced at the very beginning of the book, just as an example of a scary thing that Bilbo doesn't want to have to confront or something.
And we did mention them briefly as headcanoning them as dragonborn.
Which I think is more accurate, because no other time does Tolkien use the word worm to mean anything other than a dragon.
I agree.
In the movies, okay, this is the one problem. This is not the one problem with the movies.
It's the biggest problem with the movies.
It probably is. In the Battle of Five Armies, there are the wereworms, which, before I did any research and just listening, I thought they meant I thought they were saying weir, like WEIR, like spooky strange. Like that's a prefix. Hold on. Now I actually want to Google what that prefix. That's a real thing. Wait, like where?
It is a real thing. I mean, I think it's a water thing, but
Oh, no, it either is an alternate spelling of werewolf or something about other wolf things. Something about portals? Or maybe that's just a quote.
WEIR?
I'm refusing to even click into the top result. I'm just reading the little preview.
No, isn't it like a water thing?
Oh, a wire is a low dam built across a stream.
A water thing.
But it as a prefix is different.
Okay.
Anyway, I thought they were saying weir worms. Maybe that's just me being not British. And I was like, yeah, those worms are really weird. I agree. But the big problem that my husband has with the movies is that when they dig out of the mountains, and then instead of like doing a big jump and then back down into the ground somewhere else, they back up. And Daniel says, then aren't they just backing up into all of the orcs that are about to follow them out of the tunnel? To which I say, obviously, they have teeth on both ends and they are backing up, and then they're digging a different tunnel going in a different direction, sort of redirecting so that the orcs can then leave the tunnel. That's a lot of headcanoning for a stupid throwaway word.
Yes, but I kind of love it.
Oh yeah, wereworms obviously have teeth on both ends. If we then follow that through to the logical conclusion that wereworm obviously refers to dragonborn, because Tolkien uses the word worm to refer to dragons every single time, and for non-D&D players, dragonborn are like I can't say lizard person because that's a very different species.
That's a different connotation there.
It's like a man dragon. It's like a dragon man. They don't have tails, they don't have wings, but they got big snoots, and they sometimes have a breath weapon. They're a little man dragon. And if we then combine that with my headcanon about the wereworms at the end of The Hobbit, the Battle of Five Armies, dragonborn have teeth on both ends. It's not my fault. Tolkien said it.
For the movies specifically, because wereworms do not show up in the Battle of Five Armies in the books.
Correct. I'm combining garbage to make a bad joke about dragonborn with teeth in their butt, Sarah. Don't think about it that hard.
You're welcome.
Huge thanks to the cast of Fellowship, the musical parody of the Fellowship of the Ring, for giving us permission to use their song Happy Birthday Bilbo for the intro and outro to this episode. You can find more information in our show notes. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Fiction Fans.
Come disagree with us. We're on Twitter and Instagram @FictionFansPod. You can also email us at fictionfanspod@gmail.com.
If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and follow us wherever your podcasts might live.
We also have a Patreon where you can support us and find our show notes and a lot of other nonsense.
We also have a Discord where we complain a lot about Ring of Power.
Yes, there's a lot of complaints about Rings of Power.
That's in its own channel, though, so you don't have to deal with that if you don't want to.
Yes, it's segregated.
Thanks again for listening, and may your villains always be defeated. Bye.
Bye.